using existing antibiotics more responsibly, education of physicians, the stewardship programs that we talk about. I think you also mentioned very importantly is understanding more on the PK/PD of antibiotics, because particularly for antibiotics which have been repurposed, and I can give colistin as a classic example, which came back in 2007, we really didn't know the PK/PD of this till about 4 or 5 years later when the dosing strategy completely changed. So I think the company's position, or anybody I would say, is that there's a lot more we have to understand on AMR, not just from the fact of resistance, but also a number of things on drugs. And equally at the same time, I think the surveillance part, which we are somehow, I think, getting a grip on at least. I do see reports coming out of India, particularly the ICMR and individual centers, at least from tertiary level hospitals, about the state of the bacterial resistance in India. So I think if we put all these together, I think there is immense opportunity for the pharma industry with all its other stakeholders to be able to do something in the field of AMR.
Thank you, Dr. Gokte. Dr. Gautam Rambach is a medical director from MSD. And MSD is, of course, it's a leading pharmaceutical company, a pharmaceutical giant, plenty of anti-infectives. What is MSD's position in the strategies to tackle antimicrobial resistance? Dr. Gautam?
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Abdul. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And MSD is a global player. And as rightly pointed out by Jagdeep, antimicrobial resistance is not just something that we need to tackle it at a local level, but we really need to have a very strong collaboration between the global as well as the local level to tackle this. One of the big things which MSD has always been propagating is the having very strong surveillance programs. And again, Jaideep very rightly pointed it out that we are today having good surveillance programs, maybe not the best in the country, but definitely coming up with very strong surveillance program that helps us identify the resistance. Once we have those resistance identified, we can work around the strategies for coming out with new antibiotics, because what today the world is lacking is the antibiotics. I mean, if you look into the era of between 1980 to the year 2000, there were about 63 antibiotics that were licensed or put to clinical use, and I'm talking about the global data. From the era from 2000 to maybe 2020, just about 15 antibiotics saw the light of the day. And after that, handful. I mean, why? What is the problem? The problem is bacteria are developing more resistance quickly to antibiotics than we are discovering the antibiotics. And that is where our approach now should be slightly tangential, even from an MSD perspective or from a local or a global perspective to tackle this. Maybe tackle on the unmet needs, as Dr. Warrior pointed out, identify those targets of drug resistance, maybe have those repurposing the older drugs like Jaideep mentioned about colistin, or developing target specific therapies. Maybe apply the genomics, artificial intelligence to identify the drug resistance patterns, evolve antibiotics, maybe going for alternative therapies like a fast therapy or monoclonal antibiotics to circumvent, develop new antibiotics. And finally, what is going to play a big role is how do you make the antibiotic, maybe the newer antibiotics cheaper, have a sort of a collaboration, what we in pharmaceutical talk about public-private partnerships. So these are all the things that could go at a global level, or that is where MSD is thinking about to tackle the aspects of AMR. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gautam. Dr. Gautam stressed 3 important points. He stressed again and again collaboration, the importance of collaboration, and then the importance of utilizing new technologies like artificial intelligence, and the need for exploring alternative strategies like phage therapy or monoclonals. We will discuss about all these options and points in detail. Dr. Prunal Dalal is a medical director of GSK. And we know GSK is a leading pharmaceutical company at the global level with a list of antibiotics and more than that, a list of vaccines. And we know that vaccines play an important role in preventing infections. And if you prevent infection, we can reduce antibiotic usage and antibiotic resistance. Dr. Prunal, please explain us what exactly GSK is doing.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for giving this opportunity. Yeah, so this is one of the important segue that you came, and then you discussed a little bit about the vaccine, because one thing, what was not discussed by Dr. Gautam and Dr. Jaydeep, that is about the vaccine, because that is also one of the very, very important and critical step when it comes to the antimicrobial resistance. It's a preventive segment. The another important, and what GSK stands is almost the same as what even MSD and Cipla and all other pharmaceutical company in terms of multi-pronged approach. One is that the education, medical education, to the important healthcare physicians across India about the rational usage of antimicrobial. The not only even the HCPs, I would say the pharmacies, as well as the normal public awareness campaign. So we are actually, working towards all these educational initiatives. One of the important part, even Dr. Gautam also mentioned about the surveillance. So we are also the pioneer in terms of the surveillance, especially when it comes to the community-acquired infection. That is also very, very critical, because if you see like 70% of cases of URTI, LRTI, and when the doctors, they just select the empirical antibiotics, but probably if they do not know exactly what's the resistant and sensitive, then that will also increase the antimicrobial resistance. So that is one of the important aspects that we've been working in, even collaborating with multiple stakeholder in terms of the private as well as the public sector, in terms of bringing this data out, so that the doctors across the industry, that they would get an idea what's the resistance pattern currently. And the last piece, just would like to highlight a little bit on that, since the pharmaceutical industry and a lot of things, it's in terms of the R&D aspects also been going on. So GSK is also committed in terms of developing certain new antibiotics as well, right? So something it is also in the public domain, that is we've been collaborated with US government's BARDA, which is Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, and under which that we have developed one antibiotic that is going to be launched soon, and that has got the fantastic different mechanism of action which hasn't been explored so far. So as a part of the committed company that we've been working in multiple approach, multi-pronged approach, and eventual objectives about to bringing down the antimicrobial resistance.
Thank you, Dr. Kunal. Dr. Kunal stressed 3 points: the importance of vaccines, the importance of educating the medical community, and the most important stakeholder, educating the public, improving the public awareness on AMR and the strategies. And Dr. Akshada Mane, you are the medical lead of Pfizer, and we know Pfizer is the pharmaceutical giant in the world. And Pfizer has done wonderful work, many antibiotics, many vaccines, and have made significant contribution to the tackling AMR efforts. What is your strategy in India and at the global level in tackling antimicrobial resistance?
Thank you, Dr. Ghaffur, for the question and the opportunity to talk on this platform. Pfizer's basic purpose is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. And therefore, at Pfizer, we work towards combining science and the global resources that are available to bring out breakthrough therapies that can impact and significantly prolong a patient's lives. We have a pipeline. In fact, as the antimicrobial resistance that Dr. Gupte just mentioned, the silent pandemic that we have, we need newer resources, newer antibiotics in our fight against AMR. And when Pfizer signed the Davos Declaration in way back in 2016, we still till date, and of course in future also remain committed to this cause. The pipeline that we have that is focused on the problem that Indian hospitals currently face, which is the multi-drug resistant gram-negative infections. That's the pipeline that we are focusing on, in addition to even antifungals that are required in the ICU segment. Our breakthrough therapies is what is what excites us in our fight against AMR. The second global priority for us is the surveillance network. Pfizer has one of the largest surveillance databases in the world called as Atlas. It stands for Antimicrobial Testing Leadership and Surveillance. It has almost 833 sites from more than 80 countries, including India, participating in it. And there's data that is freely available for all the clinicians and researchers to access on a website called atlas-surveillance.com. There's a rich data of around more than 8 lakh isolates till date. What you can see is live trends of those antibiotics, the type of organisms that circulate country-wise, what have been their trends, etc. And I think the Access to Medicine Foundation called out this in their AMR benchmark report when they acknowledged Pfizer's significant stride in the area of surveillance. And finally, third pillar is, of course, how do we make antimicrobial stewardship, which is the essential solution for resistance, sustainable? Because what we've understood interacting with various doctors in hospitals and institutions is that it's a very resource intensive effort that is required when you come to stewardship, and therefore sustainability is often a concern. All our efforts are towards making this sustainable so that, in fact, all the antimicrobials get used prudently and we prolong the life of what we have. Because all said and done, antimicrobial, the pipeline, it takes some time to come, and probably the bacteria win the race here because they probably develop resistance much faster than what humans can achieve through their pipeline. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Dr. Akshada. And yes, surveillance is, of course, very important. Stewardship is important. And of course, bugs are very smart, and we all know, and they are far smarter than, and we are, we human beings are. Dr. Vasan Nagwekar, before that, we have got Dr. Sachin Bhagavat. Sorry, Sachin. Sachin Bhagavat from Wakard. Dr. Sachin, you are one of the few companies in the world with a big list of new antibiotics in the pipeline. Would you please explain to us about your pipeline and your strategies?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor. I think one of the initial comment from Dr. Anup earlier was about the challenges that the ID physicians are facing in the hospital. And we are aware of that in the sense that, at least in the India, the ICUs are almost like a kind of a war battleground where the doctor, once enters into ICU, is lost into the chaos of the antimicrobial resistance and the superbugs. And I think that today, when we are speaking about these issues about multi-drug resistant, extensively drug-resistant pathogens, need of a safer antibiotics, and PKPD enabling antibiotics, I think what we need to always, because any solution can only come when we are able to rewind ourselves back and see that why are we in this situation today. So one of the reasons that we are in situation today, and almost I'm sure all my panelists will agree with this, is that we did not pay attention to the discovery of new antibiotics as we should have been doing it in the past. And the major reason was and of course, I'm sure many of you are aware that the golden period of antibiotic discovery was between 1960 to 1980, when big pharma companies used to churn out new novel antibiotics year in and year out. And through that, we were able to manage gram-positive, gram-negative pathogens with diverse resistance mechanisms, which were even prevailing then. So one of the major difference between then and now is that we don't have an antibiotic discovery ecosystem, which was flourishing at that point in time around 20-25 years back. And for the reasons known to everybody, and because of the reason that the market is completely broken, most companies walked out, and therefore it was left to small companies to do a bit of their effort in drug discovery. So with this, I think another point that is very important to note in this current situation is that we cannot be complacent anymore as we have been in the past, because on one hand, all of us accept that the superbugs are smarter, bacteria is smarter, but then of course, we were able to manage them very well. Imagine a situation in 1980s and 70s when we had an access to 2 carbapenems in an ICU level, and we had an access to 2 or 3 BLBLIs at an ward level to manage ESBL infections, and we did fairly well in doing so. But today, now we are in a situation that we do not have any options because we did not keep the pace with the development of resistance. And we did not keep the pace because we were not in a position to bring about new antibiotics matching that to that resistance level. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to address each of these resistance settings in a very specific manner. I'm sure the esteemed panelists here are aware that the challenges in the ICU are different than the challenges in the ward. And the challenges in the ward are again different than the challenges in the community setting. So what Wokhard has tried to do in over the last 25 years is to maintain a sustained focus on the discovery of new antibiotics. Primarily, the objective was to come up with the clinically viable solutions for the treatment of resistant pathogens in all these clinical settings, provide doctors armamentarium where they can handle ICU patients with Pseudomonas infections, Acinetobacter and Klebsiella, commonly turning out to be carbapenem resistant through 2 or 3 different resistance mechanisms, come out with solutions in the ward level where try to provide therapies which can be carbapenem sparing. I think that is fundamentally important part of antibiotic stewardship, that you need to have an antibiotic which can be used in such a manner that it minimally triggers the resistance development. And that's where we really want to keep the carbapenems as far as possible away from the wards. So that's what we are trying to do. And apart from that, of course, we are looking at new antibiotics which can be given as a once-a-day antibiotic for the management of carbapenem-resistant pathogens in outpatient setting. And also we are doing some oral gram-negative antibiotic development for the community. So that's what Wokhard has tried to do, that in the absence of a kind of a very vigorous antibiotic research activity, we are looking at the possibility that we are able to bring about the products for all these all these resistance settings. And so that on one hand, we have products which can be used in this setting and do not have a minimal collateral damage of resistance development.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. We are happy to know that Wokhard has 4 to 5 molecules in the pipeline that can help us tackling AMR in India and at the global level. Dr. Vasant Nagwekar, is Vasant there?
So, Dr. Abdul, if I can just have one comment to make quickly.
Yes.
Since we are discussing part of strategies, I think there are 2 other important points to just keep in mind. One is the availability or development of rapid diagnostics. I think that's something which we haven't really focused on as a group. And that's something I think which can really help us sometimes differentiate between viral and bacterial infections, identify a bacterial strain quite quickly, and the mechanism of resistance that the bacteria produces. So if there are opportunities, and I know a lot of people are working on rapid diagnostics, that could help one. And second, we should not forget the environment, because as large manufacturers, especially in India, it's important to make sure that the way antibiotics are manufactured, what is let out in the effluents into the environment is of a certain level or below a certain level, which should not lead to actually resistance development of bacteria which are present in the environment. So I just wanted to add those 2 points as our overall strategies as companies are looking at AMR.
Dr. Gogde, thank you very much. These are 2 very important points: rapid diagnostic and the environmental aspects of the antimicrobial resistance. Thank you for mentioning these 2 points. And rapid diagnosis, of course, important even from my own personal perspective. I sit in there as a jury member of the Longitude Prize, which is a £10 million prize for a rapid diagnostic that can give us a quick diagnosis and sensitivity within 1 hour of getting the sample. And rapid diagnostic play a very important role in tackling antimicrobial resistance. And environmental, the effluent from pharmaceutical industry. And I definitely agree with you. And it's a very important part. In India, there are around 7,000 pharmaceutical companies actively manufacturing drugs. Only 1,300 of them are GMP compliant. It's no doubt that all our companies should be GMP compliant. And of course, we should take into consideration that all of our manufacturers may not be able to be immediately GMP compliant because it's expensive to be GMP compliant, but that should be our country's long-term vision or medium-term vision. And of course, we want opinion of all our esteemed panelists on these 2 points: rapid diagnostic and the importance of environmental aspects of antimicrobial resistance. Dr. Vasant Nagwekar, is Vasant there?
Yeah, I think he's here.
Okay. Meanwhile, Anoop, now we'll listen to the opinion of our esteemed panelists from the pharmaceutical industry. Now, you can make a second demand to them. What exactly now we need from them from an Indian perspective?
Yeah. So this, in the literature, it's often quoted that new antibiotic to be researched and come out into the market, it takes about 10 to 15 years and a couple of billions of dollars. Okay. And we did wonders in terms of COVID vaccine, where the complete life cycle from research to market was shortened significantly by whatever ways, policies, technology, etc., etc.
So I think even for new antibiotic research, we do have to move away from the traditional this 10 to 15 years and $1 billion, because with that kind of thing, we are never going to, like what Akshada was mentioning, even think of beating the research, the AMR onslaught, or the speed with the AMR is developing. So if at all possible, we should put our minds together into seeing how, as the industry, just like how for COVID vaccine it was done, how can we shorten the time and how can we reduce the expense? End of the day, the return from this, when it comes to the market, has to be balanced with the research. So unless you are able to cut down and manage it much less cost in terms of research and expedite the time from research into the market, we will not be able to beat this. So this is something which seriously all of us have to put our mind into and come up with. How do you shorten this period? How do you reduce this expense?
Anup, you made a very important point. In 1 year, we had 2 dozen at global level, at least 2 dozen wonderful vaccines against COVID. But that kind of rapidity hasn't happened in the world of antimicrobial resistance or in the field of antibiotics. It may be, antibiotics are not as profitable as vaccines. We all know the economics of the antibiotic development and why Big Pharma withdrew from the antibiotic development. And of course, they're all back on board now because of understanding the crisis. And we need opinion from our pharma industry colleagues. This disparity between the vaccine development and antibiotic development, especially the COVID vaccine development and the development of antibiotics. Dr. Gogte?
So I think just as we saw rapid development of COVID vaccines, there was also fairly rapid development, I would say, of COVID antiviral drugs. We saw remdesivir coming into the market within 6 months of the outbreak. And a month after the FDA approval, at least 2 Indian companies, and I know Cipla was one of them, were the first to get approval for remdesivir. We also saw rapidly, in about 6 months' time after that, molnupiravir getting introduced, and more recently, nirmatrelvir, ritonavir also getting approved. So I would also say that the COVID medication has also been quite fast. But of course, one has to go behind to see what actually helped getting all these medications, including vaccines and drugs, to the market faster. Clearly, there was a fantastic collaboration that happened between pharma industry, I think between regulatory authorities, between governments who were ready to fund projects, between perhaps non-governmental organizations. I think there was a lot of pressure from the patient community as well. All this work together to ensure such rapid development of this. And we all know the famous US plan where they put in $10 billion to rapidly, I don't remember the name of the project, but $10 billion were allocated for rapid development of COVID vaccines. How phase 1, phase 2 were practically run simultaneously. Approvals were obtained at the end of phase 2. So I think even if we think, let's say, not just COVID, if we think the way approvals are coming for anti-cancer drugs, at phase 2, with a commitment that additional data will be generated later. So I think one is, of course, the process. Second is, I think you need a large database of the entire bacteria, fungi, whatever is the drug that we're working on. You really need that foundation of good quality data of the bacteria on which we really need a new antibiotic. So just as we would like to have new antibiotics, I think equally important is to have some very basic data. And I think if we're able to build collaborations, which I may also add that while it's very good to see drug discovery happening in India of late with antibiotics, there's a lot of drug discovery happening in startups outside of India. And if there is a way that startups can collaborate with pharma companies in India, not after approval, but at phase 1 or phase 2, could bring in products at a much earlier stage. And I do know that a couple of companies are running global clinical trials in India as well, so that India gets approval faster. But if this plan can be done even earlier at phase 1, phase 2, or even when the antibiotic is being designed, right, there is an opportunity for India to get drugs quicker into the market.
Thank you, Dr. Gogte. Dr. Gogte gave us a deeper understanding about the discordance between the COVID vaccine field and the antibiotic field. He stressed that it's not just the COVID vaccine, it was the COVID diagnostics and COVID therapeutics, and the same thing is happening in the oncology field. And he also gave us the potential reasons. It's not just the pharma industry as a stakeholder. The regulators were supporting. and the public were making a demand. The public demanded COVID therapeutic, COVID diagnostics, and COVID vaccine. So it's a public demand, the regulatory support, the NGO support, the government support, and of course, the industry came on board. We need that level of collaboration. Dr. Gogte also mentioned the need of collaboration between startups who develop antibiotics and the big pharma who take it forward further. A very, very important suggestion.
Dr. Ghafoor, so does that mean that for COVID, everybody wanted it, and for AMR, not everyone wants it?
You said that because COVID is an overt pandemic, and we all say that every day. And AMR is a silent pandemic. Unless we change that scenario of silence and cry loud, as we cried very loud during COVID time, things will be slow. So it's not just pharma industry withdrew from because of funding and other issues. It's our fault as well. As doctors, yes, we are crying. The public should cry loud. Things will move fast because regulators will hear, industry will come on board faster. So we need to convince that AMR is not that silent anymore. It's much more important killer than the COVID pandemic.
So you get some question for me in between.
Oh yes, Vasant, we couldn't see you at that time. The same opinion. We listen to our industry experts and what can we demand from the industry. Now, of course, we can't demand from the industry. How can we collaborate with the industry of getting new antibiotics?
I think every day there's a problem, and we are facing this. I think there's a universal problem in India of the multi-drug resistant organism. Then we have hardly any drugs, so we request our industries, I think, one is to get into more research and have more options for our patients, for Indian patients, because this GNB and all that is our problem, Asia problem, India problem. I think we definitely require to get into more research mode. And I think for us, from our side, we can give ideas, we can provide data, and I think the industry can act on this, what newer molecules we can be having it for our patients. Otherwise, we are going to lose patients because I think one of the biggest threats for death, if you go, one of the biggest threat across among the listed 10 is antimicrobial resistance, which is most important. So I think we have to, I think the pharma industry is on board, and I think we request them to have more research for these molecules.
Yes,
so
yes. Oh, yes,
maybe
yes. Yes, go
I can give an example of a remarkable collaboration that happened for COVID, and maybe I'd like to just let it out because the whole industries are here. Dr. Warrior is also here. Vasant is also here. So I remember 8 companies applied for a clinical trial on molnupiravir. All 8 companies were asked to do a trial. Can you imagine running 8 clinical trials for the same molecule by 8 different companies? Doesn't make sense. But for the first time, 6 companies in India got together and put in a single protocol to the regulatory authorities, right? And all 6 products were approved based on one single trial done by one company's product. And regulators actually agreed that we will use that as a reference product for one trial and give approval to 6 companies simultaneously, because we may need millions of doses of such drugs. The fact that it was not required later is different. But just that in a crisis situation, and I think I just want to echo what Dr. Warrior said, everybody came together, even companies which are competitors, came together to do a single clinical trial to get 6 companies to launch molnupiravir at the same time. So I think this is the kind of collaboration we may need, even from people sit on here, to actually come together. MSD was our partner for molnupiravir. Pfizer has been the partner for nirmatrelvir, ritonavir. So I think if this is what can be done for COVID, why shouldn't it be done for antimicrobial resistance?
Yes, Dr. Gautam. Yes, the same point, the discordance between COVID and antibiotic. How can we close that discordance?
Absolutely. I think thanks, first of all, Jaideep, for bailing me out. I was going to talk about this molnupiravir example. MSD has been the one who was behind the molnupiravir. And it really was great, where when the world was thinking about only vaccine, there were antivirals which were there to tackle this pandemic. 8 companies got together. I think MSD was the one whose molecule was molnupiravir. 8 Indian companies. I was a part of the regulatory discussions at that point of time, and you could make this drug accessible. I mean, 8 companies with a multinational company. I mean, this is something we really have to think. If there is a big multinational giant with a molecule, with a good molecule, why cannot Indian companies partner with that molecule and make it accessible? I mean, access to the poorest of the person or the neediest of the person and make that molecule available. I think that is going to do wonders. And one more point I would like to bring here is our important partner. And here, our important partner, apart from you, when it comes to antibiotics, are the regulatory. The regulatory bodies today have evolved a lot. I mean, gone are those days when we just had to file an application and it comes through after 2 months and you get an approval. Today, you are asked to do rigorous clinical trials. It takes away our time. It takes away effort. I mean, there is a lot of effort. It involves a lot of money. What smart things we can do? I can suggest is, I mean, maybe India is a part of the global trial if it's a multinational that is around. But more important from our aspect is early regulatory engagements. I mean, today regulators are open for an early engagement with all of us. They can give us ideas, strategies based on your feedback, how smartly we design a trial, at what time point, what are the endpoints, because antimicrobial trials are difficult, especially if you have to identify endpoints, whether we have to go in for a placebo control or against a standard of care. We get that buy-in beforehand. It really cuts down on the trial time and helps us speed the molecule into the country. And that's what I would say. You need to have that sort of a collaboration with the regulatory, maybe have the workshops with the regulatory team. Today they are open. I can give an example. We had a regulatory workshop with the regulatory team in Sri Lanka. It helped us expedite our vaccine approval in no time. I mean, now I won't say no time, it helped us expedite that. Maybe that can be something that can be attempted also. So this is all I have to add, Abdul.
So the industry coming together, the MNC and Indian companies all coming together, and regulators coming together with the industry, the way forward, and what's happening in the antibiotic resistance field. Sachin.
Yeah, I think Dr. Ghafoor, the original point was about the comparative success between what we attained during COVID pandemic and what we are trying to attain through the development of new antibiotics. While I can understand that simplistic comparison, but I think we must keep it in mind that all the regulatory flexibility that was unleashed during the COVID pandemic time was basically when the pandemic was declared all over the world, and it was a global affair where there was a high amount of realization. And as you can understand that in that process, there was a huge amount of pressure at all levels to generate those flexibilities and do that. So of course, these examples are excellent examples of collaboration, but they were only possible to practically run out is only on the basis of the fact that there was a global pandemic that played out. In the case of antibiotics, as you initially explained, there is silent pandemic, and the silent pandemic is basically we are not able to bring forth the challenges of mortality in the ICU directly accounting it to the antimicrobial resistance. Imagine a situation that 20 to 30% of patients during COVID time actually died of antimicrobial resistance. So what do you do when you have vaccine, when you have antiviral therapies, and those are all getting compromised because you don't have effective antibiotics? So the original question that how to hasten the development and discovery of antibiotic, and that too at a lower cost, is somewhat misplaced from my perspective, because if you look at the antibiotic discovery success, it is only possible when there is a team who can work in a particular project for a particular problem for many number of years, because you need a deep insight into the project, you need understanding of the field, you need to understand the evolving resistance mechanisms. You must have the very deeper knowledge of the successful antibiotics that were there in the past, wherein we could manage so many different resistance mechanisms and pathogens and patients. And we must understand that what has led to that limitation. I think that can only happen when there is a team which can sustain the research for many, many years. And that was the model, Dr. Ghafoor, which played out in 1960 and 80. There were 6 MNC companies, big pharmas. They had programs running over 10, 15, 20 years. And based on the legacy of knowledge that they used to evolve, accumulate, they were able to deliver the antibiotics. So number one, I think that expectation can only be made when we have dedicated research programs running for years. And they are the teams who can churn out faster antibiotics because they have a know-how. We can tell you that our first IND candidate, we took almost 6 years to file IND as our first candidate. And once we started understanding this field, little bit trying to deep dive into what kind of challenges, our time to IND has considerably reduced when we have filed the last IND. So that is one way to maintain that speed of development, by having the dedicated teams who can put their time and effort for years. I think second thing which can happen is the regulatory flexibility that can be afforded to antibiotics. I think that is what happened in the COVID times. We talk about COVID vaccines. Please, I think all of us remember that they were all put into the market. They were launched without the requisite requirement for the safety and efficacy, which otherwise would have costed them 4 to 5 years or even more, and a lot of money, which was not required to be done. So we need to accord the development of antibiotic a very similar type of regulatory flexibility. And also, I think the companies need to be funded from top to bottom, and primarily because at every stage there is a need for putting the company into a place where the molecule can be taken forward from an IND stage to the NDA stage. So I think three things are important. One is there has to be sustained level of effort in the discovery so that people can come up with new solutions. Second, there should be a funding requirement at all levels. And that too, I think we'll speak a little bit later, but I would try to ascertain that any of the antibiotic stewardship programs are not possible to execute to the later end split unless we have antibiotics of that nature. Imagine a situation, Dr. Gafur, that you want to keep carbapenems away, but you don't have carbapenem sparing antibiotics. We discussed that in the earlier as well. So you need antibiotics for each of these settings. And finally, I think what is very important is that we need to simplify the antimicrobial susceptibility test development methods for these antibiotics. While largely people know that it takes a lot of time and effort to develop the antibiotic per itself, but also it takes a lot of effort to develop that antibiotic specific susceptibility testing method. So even at that level, there needs to be a kind of an enabling environment from the funding as well as from the regulatory perspective. So with all this in place, we can definitely have a situation where antibiotics can be still made available to tackle tomorrow and today's problems.
Look, Sachin, you are right. We should not call AMR a silent pandemic. It was a mistake actually to call it a silent pandemic. How can we call the silent pandemic when patients are dying in ICUs in front of our eyes everywhere in the world? How can it be silent? Yes, the public may not be witnessing that death. In COVID, public witnessed that death. And here the death is happening in ICUs and wards and other units in all countries. It's not a silent pandemic. It's a very overt pandemic. And we should take that perspective itself.
Yeah, and Dr. Gafur, I think what is very important, again, the initial question that how to make them accessible, I think we will have to reach to the level where we must be able to now think of giving emergency use approval to even novel antibiotics. And it is very relatively easy to do that and that's what was done for the COVID pandemic. Most vaccines and the antiviral drugs were approved under emergency use authorization. And we need to develop that kind of mechanism even in India, at least for those antibiotics which have been demonstrated to show the coverage of highly resistant pathogens and for which ample amount of non-clinical and clinical data is available to give you a safety and efficacy assurance. So emergency use authorization is something which we can make the drug available to needy patients. And of course, the full length approval can come when the conventional clinical trial gets over and the drug is made formally available to the market for the commercial use.
Dr. Sachin, you mentioned that, so we have to allow emergency use authorization in the case of antibiotics because there is an unmet need in the case of antibiotics. And then as we did in the case of COVID, vaccines and other drugs, then we can carry on with the clinical trials. See, there is an unmet need because we know that patients are dying because of the lack of antibiotics, and we need new regulatory pathways in the case of antibiotics. Dr. Akshata, I'll come back to you, Sachin. And Akshata?
Sure.
So, just stressing further on Dr. Sachin's point, I think the start of all this is the mortality attributable to antimicrobial resistance. Till date, I don't think we have that data especially from India, where the problem is so big. We have, I think, TB-related mortality very well documented and the focus that TB has got. But when it comes to MDR gram-negative related mortality in ICUs especially, do we have that data to create that sense of urgency amongst both the public as well as the regulators or even the HCP community as to what is it that exactly we are fighting? If we can quantify that, I think that could be a good starting point to create that sense of urgency.
Dr. Actually, you're right. We don't have that data. Kunal?
Yeah. So even what I'll say, what we've been talking a lot about gram-negative infection, because why we are talking a lot, because we know that is directly linked with the mortality, and hospital-acquired infection is the leading case, right, of all this deaths. But like, if you see the very simple thing, which is about the gram-positive bugs, right, if you see the resistance that is prevalent, and even if you have some sort of data, it is available for gram-negative bugs because it's happening, all these things are happening in the hospital. But for gram-positive infection, we do not have anything. Like if you see like OPD based, EMR system in India, like I don't think so. Not a single patient will come back and then report that, okay, like this is my follow-up visit and I'm cured right now. Even like the first time also, okay, if it is like simple infection, giving any XYZ random antibiotic, I don't know whether it's been reported in EMR system or not. So we do not have basic data set itself, like that will prove that AMR it has been significantly increased. I think what all the data that we do have, which is very much, I would say, at initial level probably, or which is not giving the right perspective. That's very very important, and that's one of the reason actually it's not that sense of urgency that we've been able to create across the world. But the second point I just wanted to highlight, regarding that regulatory and then pharma collaboration. So one thing, it's already been started in US. If you see accelerated fast track approvals and all these systems are in place in US, right? Basis on that, they got approval, they launched that product, and after that, probably if India is a part of that global clinical trial footprint country, then the trial might have been conducted, and then basis on that we apply and we get the approval. But what the next step, and a lot of this aspect that is it has been in discussion. Why can't we harmonize the global level, so global pharmaceutical along with the global regulatory, so like each and every country, they do not have to do the clinical trial again and again. Because if you see, like once it is launched in US, after that, like 10 year after that, you see that antibiotic or any other medication in India. So one set of global regulatory agency, they could work together, then that can be implemented across the world, and we can have that molecule on the land as soon as possible. So that's one framework that I think that's way that even a lot of area it can be explored.
Very, very rightly said. We need harmonization of our efforts. And Dr.
Yep.
Akshada rightly mentioned one and stressed an important part. We don't have the data on how many patients are dying because of gram-negative or gram-positive bacterial resistance. Yes, we have got global data, Lancet data 2019 alone, 1.3 million people died directly because of AMR and 5 million people indirectly. In India, we don't have such a data, but we do have a good surveillance network. Everybody stressed the importance of surveillance. We have got two wonderful surveillance systems in the country. One, ICMR surveillance of more than 24 centers, NCDC surveillance of similar number. Both these government organizations are doing excellent job in doing surveillance, and they're doing leadership role in tackling the challenge of antimicrobial resistance in the country. And our Indian government is seriously taking the antimicrobial resistance issue. I've been a committee member for almost 10 years. We know the sincerity of the government. But India, it's such a large country, 1.3 billion population, so many states and so many complex factors. It's not easy for us to implement at the ground level. And at the same time, we can't put every responsibility on the government. We NGOs has to come forward, public have to come forward, industry has to come forward. So, we have at least hundreds of NABH accredited hospitals with hundreds of NABL accredited laboratories in these hospitals. We should come forward. AMR Declaration Trust is willing to, and all these hospitals are generating surveillance data every month. It's on their computer. What we need is somebody has to just collect this data from NABL accredited laboratories inside NABH accredited hospital. And AMR Declaration Trust, we are working only on the AMR issue. We are willing to collect this data, but we need manpower support. We need funding support. If all the industry leaders here in this panel are willing to support us, AMR Declaration Trust can take the lead in collecting data from at least 500 hospitals, and within 6 months, our country will have a large data on surveillance. We are willing to work on the mortality data, the extent of the problem. Of course, government is taking the leadership role, but we should not put every responsibility on the government. We should support the government by coming forward. NGOs and public and industry should come forward and support the government initiative. And Dr. Nitin Bansal, Nitin is here. He's one of the trustees and one of the leading infectious disease consultant. Nitin is from Delhi. Nitin, what is your opinion?
Sir, I just wanted to add about this data point which was raised by Dr. Akasta and probably dealt with by Dr. Kunal also. I do not agree with them that we don't have data. We have, like you said, we have plethora of data, plethora of information. But the problem, there are two problems with those data. One of them is that they are primarily collected from tertiary care centers. What happens is that when a secondary care hospital, physician who is working in a secondary care hospital sees that data, he sees that, oh, there is so much resistance, I should start my patient on the high-end antibiotic straight away, because the data says that we are having such high resistance. So what is needed is probably that we should collect data from the smaller hospitals, the hospitals which are working in tier 2, tier 3 cities, or even lower than that, even community hospitals, district hospitals. This is something which needs to be done. And this could be very easily done, because working at ground level, we know that most of the patients who come visit these hospitals, they send their samples to the third-party labs, which basically serve as a collection centers, and those samples are then processed at different places. So I think this can be easily done, and we can get good ground level data, which is there from the secondary care hospital, basically from the primary care itself. So which will give us the right information about the extent of resistance which is prevalent in our country. This is number one. Number two is regarding the death issue which they raised, that there is no data on the number of deaths which is led by gram-negative infections or gram-positive infections. I, to an extent, agree with them. There is lack of data, but I also want to raise a question to the panelists also, and probably you also, sir. How do you decide that patient has died of gram-negative infection? I mean, you work in a cancer hospital, I work in a cancer hospital. Patient die of not only of gram-negative infection, patient die of their cancer also. Patient die of myocardial infarction, patient die of stroke. Obviously, when they die, they will have some sort of an infection if they are in the ICU. So when there is multiple modalities of immediate causes of death, to blame that AMR is the only reason for death, I think it's overestimation of AMR leading to death.
Nitin, we definitely, you made very important points, and we definitely respect that opinion. And we agree with you. We can't say there is no data on the surveillance, because there is data. We need to collect that data, compile that data, and we will be in a position, AMR declaration test will be in a position to collect that data if we get that support. And number two, you rightly said, we need the data not from tertiary care hospital. We need primary care centers. We need secondary care centers. And of course, as Nitin has mentioned, it's not that easy to say the death is because of AMR. A patient dying with a drug-resistant gram-negative infection has got so many other comorbidities. Just like COVID death, not every person who died with a COVID positivity died of COVID. But we can do, if we get enough support, we can do large data collection and do multivariate analysis, analyzing, compounding for other risk factors. We can collect the data. It's not that easy, but it's possible. And India, we have got enough data, and we have the manpower, and we have got industry and other agencies to support. We can collect that data. And for the last 3-4 years, we are perfectly in a position. We have the network, and we can collect that data if we get the support. Anoop?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I agree with Nitin in terms of having data out there. Yes, so there's data, obviously, but we have not went ahead and did the analysis, and we have not come out with any conclusions from the data. Obviously, there is a huge data bank from various surveillance systems available there. So there is a step to go ahead. The second was, I was just looking up. Apparently, WHO has published a document, GLASS methodology for calculating the attributable mortality for gram-negative bacteremia. So I guess we have a framework now. The WHO has given a framework on how to calculate attributable mortality from AMR, at least for bloodstream infections. And I guess, as Dr. Ghaffur was mentioning, we can come together. There is this framework. We can apply it on the data which we have, and we should be able to come up with conclusions.
Thank you, Anoop. I think we should do that. We know that we need surveillance data, we need mortality data, and it's easy to say, but we are willing to do that. We have got a very, very sincere senior disease infectious disease consultant like Nitin, Anoop, Vasant, and we will get, with the help of dozens of infectious disease consultants, intensivists, physicians, epidemiologists, we will be able to collect that data, and we need to do it. For the sake of our country, for the global tackling AMR efforts, we need to do it. Dr. Akshata, what is your opinion about the importance of surveillance, and how can we collect that data, existing data, and how can we generate more data?
For the surveillance part, sir, as I mentioned earlier, Pfizer's efforts in this space are even from a global perspective. The Atlas surveillance, that is antimicrobial testing leadership in surveillance, it's ongoing since 2004. And has multiple country participation. It basically also gives you year-on-year trends. There are a lot of data that is freely available on that website. So surveillance, of course, when we say empiric therapies, what should the clinicians prefer, and the stress on local epidemiology. However, these big surveillances that are going on are mostly focused. In fact, such kind of data, the lab infrastructure, the ability to test everything, it lies mostly with the tertiary care centers, as Dr. Bansal was also stating. So that's one part, having the national level representation of the tertiary care data that we have, and it is available on Atlas database. And of course, the ICMR has its own surveillance. One of the other things that we also specifically need to focus is on this community surveillance as to what is happening in the community. Specifically from a carbapenem resistance perspective, that's where I was coming from. Do we even know what's, we do not have basically data from tier 2 and tier 3. And of course, there's other part that, their diagnostics ability, their ability to, even whether they have that infrastructure to test those isolates, what's the quality of that testing? All those things are also to be considered when it comes to surveillance. Because unless we have, even if we get the newer molecules out into the market, it is important that we have a surveillance as to what is happening once you launch them in the market. And that is very important to understand if there is an emerging resistance trend that you can predict in advance. And therefore, your strategies can be planned accordingly. So yeah, that was my view on surveillance.
Yes, Dr. Akshata, if we introduce new antibiotics into a place without effective stewardship or surveillance, we will be adding fuel to the fire. We will lose that molecule so fast. And we know that's happening to ceftazidime avibactam. Many of our Klebsiella, carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella, are resistant to ceftazidime avibactam. We add Astriona. And it's only a matter of a few months or a year, we will lose this combination as well, because we have at least 24, 25 generic pharmaceutical companies marketing ceftazidime avibactam, and everybody is going to use it like a cephalosporin sulbactam or ceftriaxone. We are going to lose this molecule in immediate future, and we are dependent on this life-saving molecule. Yes, we need access, no doubt about it. We need everybody to get the antibiotic. But if we make an antibiotic that is so precious available to everybody, we are literally killing that molecule. We need regulation to restrict the usage of such antibiotic. We need regulators to come on board to restrict the usage of such antibiotic. So only those patients who really need such antibiotic, such precious antibiotic, get these antibiotics. Dr. Gautam?
Yes, thanks, Dr. Abdul Ghafoor. To add on to what Akshata was mentioning, is always timely submission of the surveillance data to the regulators. That can also be of help if one has to step up the surveillance efforts at a country level, at a healthcare level, at a community level. One important point, which I think Jaideep also mentioned some time back, was the development of diagnostic tools. I mean, if I have to go for a good surveillance, step up the surveillance, one really need to invest in these rapid diagnostic tools, because they will enable and help in timely detection of pathogens, as well as the antimicrobial resistance. And these tools can be then used in the surveillance efforts at all possible levels, maybe at a community level, healthcare level, tertiary center level, regions, as well as I would say at a global level. And collaboration with the public health agencies, I mean, that can also help up in stepping up and strengthening the surveillance efforts that can go into, because finally it's this how good a surveillance system is helps us. I mean, vaccines are one of the best examples where surveillance literally has paved a big way. I've been working with vaccines for maybe more than a decade, and I can vouch and say that good countries like US, UK, their surveillance system has really brought about the mortality, the disease burden, as well as the morbidity. And time is ripe. I mean, when we are talking about antibiotics and the antimicrobial resistance, the surveillance really has to be thought about in a big way. I mean, these are my few thoughts. If anybody wants to add, please do so. Thanks.
Kunal?
Dr. Gautam,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Gautam. Oh, okay.
so
Hello.
yeah, Kunal, go ahead. Yeah.
So very well said, but just wanted to add one thing in terms of how the surveillance it is being conducted. Many a times what happens is if there is no central laboratory available, then there is no standard methodology applies based on that how the bugs being tested against antibiotics, like what is the temperature it is there, what is the incubation and all this technique. There is a standard, there is a set standard anyone has to put in this system to see the what is the sensitivity and resistance pattern. Otherwise, like different data set, different laboratory, different standard, then it would be very difficult to say, okay, your surveillance is very, very robust, and then you can take a call basis on that. So one important piece that I just wanted to highlight about the quality piece.
The quality of the diagnostics. Kunal,
Yes.
first thing. Yes. So we need new diagnostics, and we probably one area where there is light, really light at the end of the tunnel is rapid diagnostics. Because sitting in the longitude committee as a jury member, even though I can't disclose the details about the rapid diagnosis that's coming up, a lot of, there are dozens of wonderful rapid diagnostics, innovative technologies, futuristic technologies that may come up in the next 2 or 3 years. And there are wonderful rapid diagnostics from India. Wonderful rapid diagnostic from India. So that's one area, not just from the Indian level, at the global level, we really have a hope. Though in the field of antibiotics, we are yet to see such a coordinated and intelligent action. Sachin, Akshada.
So just adding on to that, maybe one of the areas that of collaboration that can happen here is between pharmaceuticals and the diagnostics companies, right? Pfizer is also actively pursuing this collaboration with different diagnostic companies, where the effort is also one on the education front and how do you improve access to this diagnostics as well. But even before access, it's more about that educating the HCPs, all the people relevant to in the ecosystem for rapid diagnostics. So that one area of collaboration between pharmaceuticals and diagnostics is also going to be essential if we want to expand the scale of the education that we are trying to achieve.
I think, Akshata, I agree on very much on that point. In fact, I would go one step ahead to say that this is publicly known that Cipla has invested in a diagnostics company based out of Bangalore. And one of the stated objectives of that is actually to develop point-of-care diagnostics. Because as a company, we do believe that if you really want to improve overall the health of the country, then point-of-care diagnostics are critical. This is an area where Cipla has invested in. And we hope that our investment in the company actually helps in bringing forth these issues to the company, which is a startup. And they're able to develop diagnostics in India, which are point of care, including for microbiology, and not just for the others in the emergency department. And that's a hope that we do have in diagnostics.
That's a very important step, Dr. Gopte. Big pharma companies collaborating and even developing rapid diagnostic or taking over, the companies who are developing diagnostics. Because if you want rational usage of antibiotics, we need diagnostics, and rapid diagnostic is the future and the way forward.
Dr. Abdul Gautam here, just one little point to add. While we are talking about almost all stakeholders, one of the important stakeholders when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, which we maybe have not talked about, are the microbiologists. I mean, they are the in charge of the wards or the ICUs where the bacteria are grown, cultivated. And we really need a very strong collaboration between maybe ID specialists, physicians, all possible specialties, and microbiologists to understand the resistance traits, especially at a smaller hospital level, whether it's a small hospital, big hospital, tertiary care center, and have a sort of a joint collaboration so as to, from a country perspective, tackle this growing menace of antimicrobial resistance. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Dr. Gautam. Now, may I ask an opinion of all the panelists? We have wonderful pharmaceutical companies, MNCs and Indian pharmaceutical companies functioning in our country. What support we should be getting from the authorities in fast-tracking the development of new antibiotics, repurposing existing antibiotics? What support we should receive or industry should receive?
Of course, Dr. Gafuri, I can start on this. So I have a long list of such enabling supports required, but I think just to highlight some of them, I think if you are asking from the India perspective, we require a nationwide, national level funding to the antibiotic discovery and development programs, which should be commensurate to the problem we are facing. I think there is a complete disconnect between the extent of problem we are facing and the kind of funding support that we have an access to as far as India is concerned. I think it is also very important that this funding is made more pragmatic. And why I'm asking using the term pragmatic is because while one can always fund various antibiotic treatment approaches in terms of traditional, non-traditional, and some of the approaches where the clinical viability in the past has not been proven, but they are very interesting kind of a leads that can be developed into an antibiotic. But I'm sure that the panelists here would agree that all those uncharted territories in terms of antibiotic development will take a long time to materialize as a new drug. Like, for example, if you're looking at monoclonal antibodies, you're looking at peptides, you're looking at bacteriophages. These are the modalities which have always been used in the past as well. But what we are seeing is that the ability of these approaches to give a new viable antibiotic in terms of multi-indication use and our initial expectation from the industry to give a drug with a good PK/PD, I think all those aspects are going to take a lot of time to materialize as far as these so-called uncharted approaches are concerned. So what we need right now is that we need to, on one hand, support those approaches. There is no doubt about that. But what is also important is to support those approaches which have a more definitive outcome possible in the near term, so that we are able to handle the resistance issues of today and tomorrow and give a product which can handle certain type of resistance mechanisms. So I think funding agencies need to take a very balanced view on how to fund the programs which are based on, for example, existing antibiotic classes, but they still bring about a very nearly good clinical differentiation, ability to tackle some or certain or all resistance mechanisms. And there should be an support provided to them so that there is a hope that these antibiotics see the day of the light and they are able to solve the problem of today and tomorrow. So this is, I think, from the funding perspective, is something which we need. Second, we discussed a little bit back about the regulatory agencies. Again, from the Indian perspective, I think we need a dedicated regulators, for the antibiotic. This is a different ball game. Here you require the regulatory team to be in, say, for example, it should compose of clinical microbiologists, PK/PD specialists, those who are aware of resistance mechanisms. I think they should be the part of regulatory review of all the antibiotics at all the stages, so that the agencies are able to provide an enabling path forward. And it should also allow the end companies to have a course correction. For example, if there is a very competent regulatory agency, so there has to be a need of a regulatory framework which is antibiotic specific as far as we are concerned. And finally, we also expressed our requirement that for antibiotics which are at an advanced stage of development, I think a faster access can be done through emergency use authorization. I think that's where our patient today will get the drug to save their life. So these are some of the important aspects of support we get. From the longer term perspective, as far as India is concerned, I think we require 2 or 3 world-class research centers in the field of antibiotics. Again, the existing government setup centers can be used, but it is better to have a public-private partnership where these research centers will compete with each other over a period of next 10 to 15 years and see whether we can create a kind of an ecosystem of antibiotic discovery, which was present between 1960s and 1980s. And India is in a very good position to do that because of the issues that we are dealing over here. And that would help us resolve the issues for next 2 or 3 decades. So these are some of the very important aspects that we will seek to continuously look forward, support from the agencies who can help us in discovering and developing new antibiotics.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. Just to recap what Dr. Sachin has mentioned, we need our industry, Indian drug developers need support from authorities. They require funding support. And our regulator need to have a dedicated section on working on antibiotic alone. And then we need fast tracking of the new molecules. We have an urgent unmet need our patients need new antibiotics. We had a wonderful panel discussion with leading infectious disease physicians in our country and the senior medical advisors of all the important pharmaceutical companies in our country. And we all stress the importance of surveillance.
Dr. Gafur, can I just?
Yes.
So since you're coming, we are winding up with this session, this part, I just wanted to reiterate what I would take away from this. One, the unmet need of new antibiotics that requires a change in approach. We cannot continue the same way we are doing and expect to have a lot of new antibiotics in a short time. So if that has to happen, everybody has to come together, including the regulators. If that has to happen, this can't remain a silent epidemic. A lot of noise has to be made about that. And who has to make the noise? The public has to make the noise. Then only the regulators and all, whatever happened, this coming together in COVID, as you rightly mentioned, was due to pressure from the public also. So if public has to make noise, then this mortality data, attributable mortality, and why it is not silent and it is an important ongoing pandemic has to come out. And for that, we have to put our act together and come out with data, which we should be able to present to the public, which they take and understand and then make the noise, right?
Yes, Anup, public should raise the voice, and everything, if that happens, everything will happen fast. Everybody has to come together, and if public raise voice, everybody will come together. Industry will come together, medical community will come together, regulators will come together, the funding will happen, fast tracking will happen, everything will happen. And we know that public is the most important stakeholders in any health emergencies. We witnessed that, we experienced that in COVID. The same scenario should happen in AMR world at a faster pace. And we need to make that change happen. For that, we need to educate our public. And that should happen fast. Thank you all the panelists for a wonderful discussion. We will communicate with you in future. We need your support. We need your collaboration. We need to work together. We need government agencies, industry, AMR Declaration Trust, other NGOs, public. We need all to work together. It's an urgent issue at the global level, in our country, and at the global level. Thank you very much. And we will now go for the second session. May I invite Dr. Nitin Bansal, a senior infectious disease consultant working at Rajiv Gandhi Hospital in Delhi, and one of our trustees of AMR Declaration Trust, to introduce the panelists in the next session. Nitin? Nitin, your mic is off.
Thank you, sir. Our next session is on global frontiers of antibiotic development, powering the fight. Now, it is known that most of the antibiotic resistance mechanisms are already present in the microbes, even before a particular antibiotic is developed or invented. So it is basically that with the invent or use of antibiotic, that antibiotic resistance is basically unmasked. So to cut it short, basically we are one step behind in the AMR race, if I can call it the AMR race. So in order to have a sustained solution to this problem, we require a multi-pronged approach, which requires, as we were speaking in the last session, also collaboration between people working in diagnostics, therapeutics, and also clinicians, most importantly. So with this in mind, I would like to invite our panelists who are spread across all these three pillars of the AMR solution. First is Dr. John Rex. He is the editor-in-chief of AMR Solutions. Dr. Jennifer Cohn, Director, Global Access, Global Antibiotic R&D Partnership, GARD-P. John Alter, Head of External Affairs, AMR Action Fund. Rich Lawson, Senior Project Manager at CarbX. Dr. Vasan, Senior Vice President, Bugworks. And Dr. Ashwini Taide, Clinician, Infectious Disease Physician, Trustee of AMR Trust. I welcome all the panelists, and we hope that we have a good discussion. For the discussion, I request Gafur sir to please take forward from here.
Thank you, Nitin. We are so lucky today to have very important individuals representing very important organizations in the world attending our meeting as panelists. It's very difficult to get all of them together on board for one meeting. And thank you very much. Dr. John Rex is editor-in-chief of AMR Solutions. And much more than that, he's one of the most experienced individuals in the drug development world. He's an infectious disease physician. By training, he was an infectious disease physician. He practiced infectious disease. He changed over the industry, and he made significant contribution to the drug development, anti-infective drug development field. He's one of the most experienced experts in the anti-infective drug development world today. And Dr. Drucks, please tell us what exactly is happening at global level to fast track the development of antibiotics. John?
Off mute makes a big difference every time. How about that? Thanks, Abdul, for the opportunity to be here today for that kind introduction. Globally, you use the word fast track, and I guess I'm going to say we would all like antibiotics to be developed quickly, but I also say I'd like to see them developed, and speed is not always what you can deliver. And the parts that I think that are most interesting right now have to do with the level of political interest in this area. The need for political leadership to understand this problem is critical, because that's how you actually get it paid for at the end of the day. And the very exciting evolution over the past 10, 15 years is that we now see this problem being discussed at a global political level. And AMR came at the highest level, the UN General Assembly in 2016, and we're going to see AMR back on the UNGA agenda in 2024. And I think that, you know, if I want to point at one thing that's going to make all this happen, it's that. It's because we have people who aren't us, who aren't the techie, geeky ID doctors like me, like you, who are thinking about particular kinds of drugs that are needed, but rather it's about the global political understanding that we actually have to pay for these things in a different sort of a way. And that concept, the idea of pull mechanisms to bring antibiotics to keep antibiotics in existence is to my mind the most important evolution of the past 10 years. You're going to hear some other cool work from other people in this and there's some fantastic technologies coming and some interesting drugs coming. Those will never be drugs, or they won't stay on the market if we don't fix the far end of the problem, which is the maintenance problem, the keeping drugs on the market. And my last comment, I'll close by saying a complete plug, AMR.solutions. It's a free newsletter that if you're interested in development in this space, please sign up. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Please stay back because we need your opinion and suggestions on several other important global issues on antibiotic development. I'll come to Jennifer Korn. Jen, you represent GARDAP, and GARDAP is an important organization, you know, encouraging and funding drug development and for big, good, promising drugs across the world. Please tell us more about GARDAP so our audience can understand the excellent work GARDAP does.
Great, thank you. And just to say thank you for inviting GARDP to this important discussion. I've really enjoyed the first part. So the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership is a nonprofit organization, and we're really focused on development of antibiotics that are active against the WHO priority pathogen list. So really antibiotics that are of high public need and where there's a gap in development or access. But we're not only focused on kind of the research and development, especially on late stage clinical trials, we're also very much focused on access to these antibiotics and appropriate use. So what we want to do is ensure that antibiotics, either new chemical entities or repurposed older antibiotics, actually get the data needed not only to get to that initial registration, but also the data needed for their public health use. So we want to make sure that clinicians have in their hands the data to use against the about the target antibiotics in the target populations, and that includes children and babies. And then we also want to make sure that these products are affordable, are available, and that the guidelines and data supports their appropriate use. We really value the local and regional partnerships to make sure that we're working to figure out what is the local epidemiology, what are the local resources and health system context, and how can these products be basically positioned in the existing formulary how do we make our diagnostic and antibiotic algorithms appropriate so that patients can actually get these products and that we know which patients these products can be most useful. So at GARD-P, we have a portfolio that spans two major areas, sepsis and serious bacterial infections, and then sexually transmitted infections with a focus on drug-resistant gonorrhea. Within sepsis and serious bacterial infections, we have two new chemical entities that GARD-P has the license for a number of different geographies. One is cefiderocol, and that's a product that's actually already US FDA, EMA approved, and on the WHO essential medicines list. And the WHO pre-qualification program has actually recently released an expression of interest for submission of cefiderocol. GARD-P has the license essentially for development, manufacture, and commercialization of this product across 135 countries, including India. And then we also are working very closely with Venatorix on a product called cefepime-taniborbactam. Again, both of these products have in vitro and now clinical data against carbapenem-resistant bacteria. Cefiderocol also has in vitro activity against carbapenem-resistant Acinetobacter. And then finally, we are working with a couple basically repurposed drugs to look at neonatal sepsis. Neonatal sepsis is a huge problem. The current WHO guidelines recommend ampicillin and gentamicin, but we know according to very large studies that this is inadequate and that many infections are actually caused by ESBL bacteria, particularly Klebsiella, and that mortality in neonatal sepsis in some cases up to 25-30%. This is a really unacceptable situation. So GARD-P is working in partnership with a number of different organizations to really focus on what are the current products that are being used and then compare them to new combinations of products, including repurposed products like fosfomycin and flumoxif that have activity against ESBLs to figure out what are the best optimal products to be used. And then finally, in sexually transmitted infections, we have a new chemical entity called zoliflodacin, whose phase 3 is just going to be wrapping up this year, and it has in vitro activity against ceftriaxone-resistant gonorrhea. So across all these products, we really also want to work closely with researchers across the globe, but also with a focus on low and middle income countries where the burdens of these diseases is truly higher to make sure we are getting the data we need, enrolling the patients that have the target infections, and really getting to the evidence that that will help support optimal use, and then working with partners in terms of ministries and private sector to actually implement these drugs appropriately. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen, for your kind introduction on what GARD-P is. We would like to learn that in detail later on the details of the excellent work GARD-P does. I'll come back to you. Rich Lawson from Carbex. You know, I used to attend Carbex meetings during the COVID time on drug development and other committees. And Carbex is doing an excellent job. We appreciate the wonderful work you do in supporting companies, drug developers across the world in fast-tracking the development of new antibiotics. Please tell us more about Carbex.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a great panel, and it's I'm so pleased that you have organized this session with the session and the session before as well. It's great to have these opportunities. Carbex is focused really on the translational space between basic research, often coming out of government labs or academic labs, and later stage clinical development. So we focus for therapeutics in the area from hit to lead optimization, preclinical, and phase 1 studies to prepare compounds for de-risking, really, so that they could be invested in by pharmaceutical companies or other organizations that are downstream. And we do invest in companies that are working on therapeutics, but also diagnostics and preventatives like vaccines as well. One thing that's worth noting is that Carbex has been doing this for a number of years now, and we have been fortunate to find that there is actually a fair amount of innovation coming out of early research, out of the basic research. And we continue to see really interesting, exciting applications to Carbex for funding. And we often say that Carbex only does two things fundamentally in this space. One is that we aim to make good investments. And then second, we aim to make those good investments even better by working closely with the companies through the life of the relationship with Carbex. So it's more than just money. We provide them with connections to subject matter experts and capabilities that they may not have access to, because the majority of companies that we invest in are very small companies. The majority have 10 or fewer employees. And so in the older days, when large pharmaceutical companies were actively investing in research and development in this space, back when I was, for example, with AstraZeneca, as John Rex was as well, large pharmaceutical companies would partner with small companies and nascent companies and could provide some of that expertise and some of that support. It doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. And so having that partnership and access to subject matter experts through the life of the program, whether it's toxicology or regulatory affairs and so forth, we think is really valuable. And we really appreciate the idea of the partnerships within this ecosystem that enable product developers to progress from basic research all the way through clinical development. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, for your introduction on the work Carbex does, and also mentioning the support. You support much more than providing funds. You provide connections and you provide expertise. Thank you very much. We have John Alter, Head of the External Affairs of the AMR Action Fund, a very important organization in stimulating the development of antibiotics. John?
Yep, thank you, Dr. Gafoor, and again, thanks for asking us to participate on this esteemed panel. So the AMR Action Fund, for those that don't know, was created back in 2020, only a few years ago, through collaboration between the World Health Organization, the Wellcome Trust, and several pharmaceutical companies. We are a venture capital fund that invests in the late stage clinical pipeline, what Rich just talked about, complementary there. And we are investing in companies that have traditional technologies like beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitors. We invest in non-traditional, so like bacteriophage companies. And we also have recently invested in a rapid diagnostic company. Our goal is to bring up to 4 new products to the market by the end of this decade, hopefully more, but that requires a lot of work and collaboration. And then the other thing that we're looking to do is help influence the external environment, because the status quo does need to change. We need to fix how society values these very important antibiotic, antifungal products as we move forward. Only then can we be successful for patients in the future.
Thank you, John. And you mentioned that AMR Action Fund functions as a venture capitalist. And when we discuss further, we would like to learn the modus operandi or the business model between the difference between AMR Action Fund, GARDAP, and Carbex. We are very keen to learn about that. And also we are excited to learn that you're funding bacteriophages and diagnostics, because phages is another potential that we need to explore. We have Vasan Sambandamurthy here from Bugworks. And Vasan Sambandamurthy and his friend Anand Kumar, we are proud of what you do as an Indian startup who is working towards developing a very good molecule that has got excellent activity against drug-resistant gram-negatives. Dr. Vasan, we are very excited to learn the excellent work Bugworks does.
Good afternoon, good morning, and thank you so much, Dr. Gafoor, for inviting me to this panel, and I'm so privileged to be among these global experts. And again, I enjoyed the first session, which was very engaging, and thanks to AMR Declaration Trust for organizing these webinars to create awareness among policymakers, drug developers, and the general public. So to give a quick background about Bugworks is a decade-old company. Some of the co-founders of Bugworks came from the erstwhile AstraZeneca R&D, and I'm very glad to meet some of my former colleagues, John and Rick, in this call. So we started focusing on AMR, and we really wanted to leverage the knowledge, the collective knowledge of the company, what we gained from Big Pharma in terms of addressing the WHO priority pathogens. And as you heard in the earlier webinars, we forged partnerships with tertiary care hospitals, where we had access to phenomenal collection of real-world isolates from India, which are multi-drug resistant, some XDR isolates. So we could really screen our compounds early on and apply very quick decision-making to really cut out molecules which did not have a chance to stand. And most importantly, Bugworks embraced the power of collaborative networks. And we are extremely proud and happy that we are one of the first companies outside the US and Europe to get CARPEX funding. Subsequently, we also get funding from CARPI, and we are supported by some phenomenal global experts advising us on microbiology, PKPD, clinical development, as well as on manufacturing. So we're very happy that we have a small footprint, very nimble, quick decision-making, and we really believe in partnerships and leveraging expertise that's available readily out there and quick to learn in terms of what's happening. And we also really start having conversations very early on in terms of how do we influence the policy around antibiotic approvals, the regulatory pathways. We also bake in an important concept of access very early on, like partners with GARPI. And also we built in affordability as something which is very core to the company's philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vasan. We are proud of Bugworks, and also we are happy to learn that international agencies are supporting the development of antibiotics with Bugworks. Dr. Ashwini, you are one of the leading infectious disease consultants in the country, one of the trustees of AMR Declaration Trust. Today, we have giants in the field of drug development. And how happy you are today by listening to the words from these big funding agencies who support the development of antibiotics. Are we seeing the light at the end of the tunnel?
Thank you, sir. It's really heartening to be amongst all these esteemed panelists. Basically, I practice in a second-tier city in India. So we know, and we are discussing that gram-negative resistance is a significant problem in India, to the extent that acinato resistance is somewhere 70% to the carbapenems. When we practice at tier 2 city, the basic problem is we have data, ICMR data, we have data from India which says, okay, the resistance is 70%, 60% somewhere. But what happens at grassroots level is quite a few of the basic institute, rural institute, public institute, the diagnostic is not available. We don't have even Vitek MICs at the grassroots level. So how do we collect the data from grassroots level when we don't have Vitek MICs there? We are in an era wherein we have resistance to Casavi Estionam, synergy test is coming negative. But then there are areas wherein these tests are not available and people are randomly using these molecules. So this is a ground root scenario actually. So it's really heartening to see all of you here who can really contribute, because what we need is for diagnostic point of care test, and definitely we need a new molecule for to handle the gram-negative resistance in India. So will be really interesting to listen to all of you and get something concrete for our AMR plan.
Our esteemed panelists from international organization. Now, this is the reality from a tier 2 city, and Dr. Ashwini is the infectious disease specialist. She knows exactly what's happening in a tier 2 city. Increase in resistance, diagnostic issues, lack of diagnostic issues, increase in resistance even into ceftazidime avibactam. We are losing synergy of ceftazidime avibactam to Astriana. That's a reality scenario. And this is what we need to tackle in India and across the world. At global level, this is the challenge. And this is the ground level reality in most countries, not just India, at global level. And this is the scenario. This is the reality. This is what we need to tackle today, not tomorrow. Dr. Ashwini is not requesting to act tomorrow. She's giving you the reality from today. It's scary to know that we are losing synergy between aztreonam and ceftazidime avibactam. And that's the global scenario. Dr. John Rex, we are back to you. You know the global scenario, and then you always discuss about the Pasteur Act in the US Senate. John, would you please update us what's happening? Because we are keen to know what's happening in US, a country with potential resources to fund and accelerate antibiotic development. John Rex,
Off
John, you are there?
off mute. There we go. Okay. So thanks for the opportunity to discuss the broader topic of pull. So you've asked about the Pasteur Act in the United States. Let me actually generalize that and say that globally, there is a strong movement right now towards the creation of meaningful pull incentives. And just to be clear for those who may not have that in their background, the idea of a pull incentive is to think about the need to buy a new antibiotic in the same way that you buy something like a fire extinguisher. That's sort of my favorite analogy. Antibiotics are the fire extinguishers of medicine. And fire extinguishers is something you don't think about every day. And you may think, well, I've actually not used one today, this week, this month. Maybe I think I've never used one in my life, but in fact, you have. Fire extinguishers are like insurance. There's something that's ready when you need it at that moment, and you prefer not to use it. And I'd rather not have a resistant infection, but when I do need a drug for resistant infection, I want it to exist. So that's the idea of fire extinguishers, and we need to buy antibiotics in the same way as a community that we buy fire extinguishers. And so the Pasteur Act, along with action, here I'm really going to point at the United Kingdom, where the National Health Service of England has partnered with NICE, the Health Technology Assessor, to think about how to buy antibiotics like fire extinguishers. And they have put in place the world's first true active running pull incentive. They're now buying 2 antibiotics in the same way for England, in the same way that you buy a fire extinguisher. Nobody's ever done that before. It's a great experiment. We're seeing how to define the rules of what kind of fire extinguisher to buy. We're going to see them evolving those rules, and that's the lead that's getting us to, like in the United States, where we have the Pasteur Act, which has now been reintroduced in the United States Congress, which is meant to do something like what was being done in England, which is to buy antibiotics on a fire extinguisher-like basis, or sometimes called a subscription basis. Sometimes people call it the Netflix model. These are all ideas that relate in the same way. We are hopeful that Pasteur will pass this year. We'll get, you have all the political stuff. It takes a lot of work. We're working on it for a number of years. We've actually now got support widely within Congress, and fingers are crossed that that's going to occur. But it's not just the United States, and it's not just the UK. It's also Canada, Japan, European Union. We're seeing all of the G7 in one way or another is involved in thinking about creating meaningful pull incentives. And to me, this is the number one fix left to put in place. We've built a lot of the ecosystem. We have created the push incentives. Carbex has done fabulous work. Novo Repair, similarly, the GARD-P, the AMR Action Fund, the Global R&D Hub. We put all these things in place that are turning up the work to create the molecules. But if we don't create the pull for them downstream, we're going to see really valuable new drugs disappear and not be available. You can't access what isn't being made, and if you got to pay for it, you want to keep it on the market. So that's what's going on. I'm hopeful that we're going to see a real tipping point on this. We're sort of at that point, and it's never happens on one day, but we're close to really having things in place. And the UK has actually done it. So I mean, I think if they've done it, the rest of us can do it, and that's what we're pushing on. That's what I spend a fair bit of my time on, is supporting that. So the conversations like this are about spreading the word about why you need to do this. So thanks for asking.
Thank you, John, for comparing antibiotics with fire extinguishers. Of course, new antibiotics are fire extinguishers because we have a fire, we have a global fire, and we need global fire, not just one extinguisher, many fire extinguishers. And Pasteur Act will, if passed by the American Senate, will accelerate the antibiotic development. And it's not just the US citizens who is going to benefit out of it. The world is going to benefit out of it, because antimicrobial resistance is a global challenge. Yes, the situation may not be that bad in gram negatives. Yes, it's raising in America, but it will raise because AMR is a global challenge. It's going to spread in all countries. No country can insulate from the issues of antimicrobial resistance. We need governments to fund antimicrobial resistance, antimicrobial drug development, because that's the need of the hour to extinguish the global fire. Jen, we need your opinion about John's comparison of fire and the fire extinguisher. And we need to learn in detail what GARDAP is doing in inspiring the development of fire extinguishers.
Great, thank you. So, I would say that in some cases, the analogy of the fire extinguisher is very apt. So I'm an infectious disease doctor. Right now, I'm in Philadelphia, where I'm faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm rounding on the infectious disease service. A lot of these drugs are positioned as fire extinguishers. We have them for the patients who are most in need, and there are those patients who need them urgently. But I'm also working very closely with colleagues in India and in South Africa. They are on fire right now. It is not just a fire extinguisher. We need to actively have firefighters putting things out. They are in need. These products should be used appropriately, of course, but there is a real urgent and felt need at this moment. And so really what GARD-P is trying to do is, one, to work with countries, the experts in countries, WHO and others, to figure out what are the products that currently are available but may not be registered or may be priced out of reach in those countries, and figure out how can we work to get those products to fight the fires that are burning right now, and work to see how these can be positioned, how we can optimize the drug formulary, and think about this like a chess game. What are the moves we're making now? What are the moves we need to make 2, 3 chess moves down the line? And what are the antibiotics we're going to need in those 2, 3 moves? And how can we set up not only our access work, but our development work to be prioritized and strategic to meet the burning need now, but also the 2 moves down the line? And so those are some of the things that we currently are working on. We're working with the WHO on further work on drug optimization. So for instance, in March, the WHO put out the pediatric drug optimization for AMR priority list, which goes one step even more granular than the WHO priority pathogens, and really says for children, here are the most urgent unmet needs in the areas of highest burden, not only for new antibiotics, but formulations of older antibiotics. We think this is a really important step, and we think this can be done also for adults. So really drug optimization, a process at the global level, but also countries to take on drug optimization processes at the local level, so that there can be potentially more strong formularies that can consolidate the market. And then we can really work on the highest priority medicines within that drug optimized list for access. And access means working on registration. So working, for instance, with the WHO pre-qualification program to get expressions of interest released for critical antibiotics. The WHO PQ for cefiderocol was actually the first time they opened a PQ for an antibiotic to treat a drug-resistant bacteria. This opens up a whole new area where we can use the WHO PQ process for collaborative registrational procedures to improve the process and accelerate the process for registration. I absolutely agree. I would strongly support regional harmonization and reliance pathways on national regulatory authorities of regional reliance, so that we can also simplify things on the supplier side. And then we also need to make sure that we are getting products that can be affordable, priced appropriately for sustainability for both the buyer, but also the supplier, but then making sure that we can get budgets in place and do advanced planning. I think there's a lot of efficiencies we can actually squeeze out of the market right now. The forecasting, the procurement right now is incredibly fragmented, often short-term and unreliable. If we can improve forecasting, consolidate the market, potentially even pool forecasting or even pool procurement and do order planning and order consolidation, there are a lot of efficiencies I think we can squeeze out of this market that will make the supply security better, but also potentially make products a bit more affordable, especially in countries like in South Africa, where, yes, they have a lot of carbapenem-resistant Enterobacter-ales. A lot of it is OXA-48. Ceftaz-Avi would work very well. It's priced out of reach for the public market. This is a huge problem. And so I think there's actually a lot of low-hanging fruits that we can work on right now and access. And then some of those higher, more difficult things that also need kind of a consolidated approach through a much better, more diverse ecosystem that I think John, that both of the Johns talked about just now, in terms of who can we work with in terms of implementation? Who can we work with in terms of potentially improved regulatory harmonization? Who can we work with maybe even in terms of pooled procurement? And we really need that ecosystem to fight, not only develop the fire extinguishers, but also fight the current fires. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. I know that you have one fire extinguisher in your armamentarium called ceftriaxone. I'll come back to you later because I got a special interest in getting that fire extinguisher in my hospital, but I'll come back to you because I need to discuss that in detail. John Alter from AMR Action Fund. John Alter?
Yes.
John, what is your modus operandi for supporting development of fire extinguishers and how many companies you support? We want to learn the details.
Yeah, so we're currently have 5 companies in our portfolio. Hopefully in the next, let's say, 90 days, we hopefully will announce 2 additional ones. We have met with many of the companies already to learn about their technologies. We have an independent scientific advisory board that is chaired by the Dr. John Rex. So he can also give you an opinion on our modus operandi. The scientific advisory board will meet. They'll learn about the different technologies, molecules that are being developed. We focus on the priority pathogen list of the WHO and the US CDC. So we're looking at that because, again, we want to tackle the highest unmet medical needs and where those products can make the largest impact for patients. If the scientific advisory board gives their endorsement, then we have an investment committee that will meet and discuss with the various companies and to learn, I think Rich used the phrase more than money, the same. We like to help advise the company in terms of their development programs, their regulatory filing strategies, their access and stewardship plans as they progress towards bringing a product to market. And then we have the difficult discussions about how are they going to stay alive. And that's why, as others have mentioned, the pull incentives are so necessary because so many of the previous companies have filed for bankruptcy, and some of those products are, while still available, not from the original developer.
Can I ask a secret, probably, or public information? How much money you have in your pocket?
The total amount of the fund is approximately $1 billion. And that's to be used for both, let's say, initial investments as well as subsequent investments, because whether we invest at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, as you're aware, those amounts increase over time as you're looking to run the trial for a larger population. And so we need to understand, what some of those funding requirements may be of the companies over the years that we look to invest in them. But our plan hopefully is to invest somewhere between 15 and 20 portfolio companies. And we said with the goal of trying to bring several products to market by the end of the decade.
Thank you, John. That's very nice to hear that there are organizations seriously working to inspire and stimulate antibiotic development. Rich Lawson from Carbex, please tell us in detail your business model or the modus operandi in supporting drug developers. And you mentioned you support diagnostics and other alternative strategies like bacteriophages. We would like to learn more about all these strategies.
Yes, thank you. And one thing I'd like to emphasize is the nature of the ecosystem, not just the Carbex modus operandi, but the system within the ecosystem, because there really are important links in the chain. That we often describe the different parts of the ecosystem in that way, because it can be a little bit confusing to try to understand where Carbex fits alongside GARD-P, alongside the AMR Action Fund and other organizations. There are a lot of players, and we all have an important role that is complementary. And thankfully, there's a really good collaboration and good partnership within the ecosystem. But we do describe this often as links in a chain with basic research, usually funded by governments and academia and so forth, that we all are familiar with. We could see that as the beginning link in the chain. Carbex then comes in after that point to help translate those basic ideas into products that could eventually make it into clinical trials. And as I mentioned earlier, for therapeutics, we focus on hit to lead optimization, and so forth, getting into phase 1 clinical trials and preparing products for phase 2 and later clinical development. And that's as far as we go, because we are trying to cover that gap. Just as the others have talked about, we focus on the most critical pathogens, the most critical indications for bacteria. And we do similar things, as you said, with diagnostics and preventatives like vaccines. But we rely on partners downstream, like the AMR Action Fund and GARD-P and other organizations, to pick up the products at that point. We don't do phase 2 studies. We don't do phase 3. We don't prepare for commercialization. We don't help with direct access to markets. We rely on GARD-P and AMR Action Fund for the investments in downstream stages. And then, as John Rex talked about, the chain after that really is the pull of the market. We really need market reforms in order for everything to flow along. And if any one of those links in the chain is broken, then the whole thing falls apart. If any one is weak, that will be the limiting step in the overall flow of products getting out to patients. And so, even though there are no direct connections through each step in the ecosystem, we do really believe very strongly in the importance of collaboration and coordination with people working earlier in basic research and people working downstream like GARD-P and the AMR Action Fund. So that entire ecosystem, I think, is really important. And I wanted to emphasize the system within the ecosystem. There is a logic, there is a structure to it that's really important, and we need to support all the parts of that.
Thank you, Rich, for stressing one aspect. Carbex supports the early drug development stage, while organizations like GARDA and AMR Action Fund supports the later drug development stage, including the marketing process. And may I ask you how much money you have in your wallet?
Well, we are very fortunate to have received funding from the US government, the Wellcome Trust, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, German government, and the UK government, where the funds have been committed over from the US government a 10-year period, from other funders. It's different amounts over different periods of time. Because as John said, John Alter said, earlier research is less expensive than later clinical development. So we have, the total commitment has been a little over $500,000 up to this point. Sorry, $500 million up to this point. And we're continuing to seek additional funding because this stage in the link is still underinvested. We're very grateful for the funding that we've received so far, but there are a lot of good innovative products that can be transitioned to clinical trials. We just don't have enough funding to support all the good ideas that are out there right now.
Thank you, Rich. Vasan from Bugworks.
Yes.
Vasan, now for your drug development and what support you received from various agencies, because drug development is so expensive and a startup like that, like yours, cannot take money from pocket, but I'm sure you have done some investment from your personal expenses as well, but you have received wonderful support from various organizations. And would you please explain us about what support you received and what additional support you require from various organizations?
Sure, great question. So to continue with the fire extinguisher narrative, Bugworks has designed a state-of-the-art fire extinguisher, taking into consideration inputs from experts and global partners, which has a global appeal and can fight fires coming out of gram-positives, gram-negatives, as well as biothreat pathogens. The fire extinguisher we're talking about is called BWC0977, a truly broad-spectrum antibiotic after the 1960s. It's a novel class. And we have pressure tested this fire extinguisher across global isolates, close to 10,000 isolates. And we continue to screen to ensure that we are able to catch any unwanted fires and to understand what's going on. So that's one. And most importantly, we are also baking in efficiency in terms of cost, because we really want to leverage the cost advantage of having operations out of India, continue to strengthen our collaborations, and also build in affordability and access into our fire extinguisher. In terms of funding, Dr. Gafoor, we were very lucky early on to get funding from Government of India via the BIRAC grant. The BIRAC has done a great job in really supporting early innovators and ideas, such that there is a broad base of companies which have started seeding in ideas and taking it to the next level. But what we see is once good ideas mature or evolve into the next stage of, let's say, a preclinical development, the cost required is very high. That's where there's been a huge gap. And that's why Bugworks has reached out to global funders, and as I mentioned earlier, very glad that we get funding from CARB-X. We also got funding from GARPI. That really helps us to take the molecule towards clinical development. As we speak, our fire extinguisher BWC0977 is undergoing a phase 1 trial in healthy volunteers. This study is happening in Australia for economic reasons, as well as in terms of the regulatory environment. We hope that the study will be completed early next year, and that will really help us to position, given its broad spectrum microbiological activity, we should be able to position BWC0977 to address a variety of bacterial infections, both in a hospital setting, which is of top priority to clinicians here, including you, as well as in the community setting, basically bacterial pneumonias, plus also if there is a requirement for any biothreat indication, 977 can be really utilized. And we still need funding. So we are really in what you call a battle to raise funds to sustain and take it to phase 2 and beyond. And as John and others have said, we also start wondering about how are we going to survive once the molecule moves into advanced development and finally into commercial, right? So as the earlier speakers have alluded to, it's very important that we fix the broken market conditions. And that's very important. And passing of pull incentives like Pasture Act, as well as what's happening in UK, Sweden, and Japan, I hope that we will have something similar in India, because where the burden of AMR is very high and the need for an antibiotic like 977 is going to be very high. So I think India, with its chair of G20 presidency, it's a right time to really adopt some of the things which are happening there and help us coming up with enabling a regulatory environment, sustain funding for late stage development, and also think about something in terms of pull incentives.
Thank you, Vasan, for your wonderful the work bug work is doing. And we are so happy that Government of India, BIRAC, supported the early drug development of your molecule, and later you received excellent support from GARDAP and CARBEX. But now you need additional support. You need additional funding support, and you really want regulatory mechanism, full incentives and other support, just like what's happening in UK or US or other countries. And G20 is a wonderful opportunity for us to make that happen, for additional funding for our excellent drug developers like yours, and other mechanism to be in place. And India is a leader, and we are always wonderful in providing leaderships, not just in India, for global initiatives. And I'm sure our leaders will be willing to support us for the cause of AMR, because our government always support anything that is important. And I'm sure our government has realized how important it is, but we should keep on communicating to keep the momentum on, so that really happens on the ground. Thank you, Vasan. And Dr. Ashwini, you listen to the leaders, the global leaders. Now, what do you think now about the global, what's happening in the world, and what will happen in the future? And there is one molecule, for example, Jen from GARDAP. Jen has a molecule, cefiderocol. And we really hope we need cefiderocol. How urgently you need cefiderocol for your patients?
Cefiderocol, like we are discussing, we are losing out Cazavi. We have already lost colistin. Yesterday, I had one of my renal transplant patient who had urosepsis, colistin MICs were 16, and it was CLEB basically. So, and it was NDM positive. So no question of using Cazavi, STO, synergy was negative. So these are the scenarios which we face often. And these are the scenarios, these are the patients we need a molecule like cefiderocol at a reasonable cost, because all these patients are really poor and they cannot afford a molecule which is imported. Right now also there are few patients who are getting cefiderocol, but then the cost is really huge. We have few molecules which are there, but then if we need those molecules, we'll have to ask for compassionate use, like the Zedibactam, which is available. So in practical situation, when we face a situation wherein we have CRE, colistin resistant, these are the situations, the need of cefiderocol is really urgent. And it has to come to market very soon, because there are quite a few patients who are in need of this molecule.
Jen, after this meeting, Jen, like me, Ashwini, Vasan, Nitin, we all, when we go back to the hospital after this meeting, we need to see more patients. We need cefiderocol. We need cefiderocol, and not tomorrow, this evening we need cefiderocol. And you have cefiderocol. How can you help us in getting the cefiderocol in India as fast as possible?
Yeah, I'll be very brief. We have the license. We are attempting right now. We found a very excellent potential manufacturer who can produce it for a much lower cost. We hope to actually have an announcement in the next month about that. Then it will take a bit of time for that manufacturer to develop the product. It is a complex molecule, but during the kind of 2 years or so that we expect the manufacturer to develop that product, we'll be working closely with experts to figure out how to position that molecule, how to create the budgets, how to do the forecasting, procurement planning, so that we can hit the ground running. And in the meantime, really figure out the drug optimization of the other molecules that might be needed, and work through entities like Secure to try to improve access to other molecules, both in the time it takes to get cefiderocol, but also beyond. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. That's really reassuring. Thanks for your excellent work. Dr. Vasant Nagwekar, an infectious disease consultant.
Yes, sir.
Please give your opinion and your expectation from international agencies, and what additional things should happen from our side as well.
Yeah, so I think we are, as I think the whole discussion goes about the multi-drug resistant organisms, and especially we are struggling for some of the pathogens where even this earlier ceftazidime-avibactam astronam combination not working at all for the E. coli and to a small extent Klebsiella, which was initially being a good molecule. And I think specifically for multi-drug resistant Pseudomonas and Acinetobacters, we hardly have any drugs except when you have colistin resistance, we're just struggling for that. And I think for that, we were looking for drugs like cefiderocol, which is a more broad spectrum, and the experimental drug from Wuhan, which has been very, very promising in vitro and also in a couple of patients where it has been in vivo also, that is cefepime-zidobactam. So I think this two molecules which we are looking, one is cefepime-zidobactam, which is supposed to be in phase 3 trial now. Phase 1, phase 2 has done well, and it is available for compassionate usage for really sick patients where we're dealing with colistin resistant or pan-drug resistant bacteria, maybe Pseudomonas or Acinetobacter, which has shown at least in vitro a good sensitivity. In fact, recently we have tested around 27 isolates which were MDR Pseudomonas. We did the genotypic and phenotypic sensitivity, and we found that initially majority of the Pseudomonas which we had were predominantly non-NDM. So we had options of ceftolozane, tizobactam. So they were not NDM or Vim. So the mechanisms were at the efflux of foreign. So we had ceftolozane, tizobactam on compassionate ground, or our patient used to get it from abroad. But now the Pseudomonas have been 70% of the Pseudomonas are now NDM. So that means even your ceftolozane, tizobactam is not good to go. So I think for such organisms, we definitely look forward for cefiderocol, which is already an US FDA approved drug, and cefepime-zidobactam is an Indian research molecule which is in phase 3 trial. I think we are struggling, and I think we require more support for our GNBs. We have a lot of, in fact, whenever we have a multi-drug resistant GNB, it is not very difficult to make a choice because we are hardly left out with any choice. But when it's a MRSA, we have a basket of 15 drugs, so it becomes difficult which one to choose. So that's the status. So I think we require more and more research, and there's definitely more drugs to be there.
Yes, Dr. Vasan, we are struggling. The world is struggling. On one end, we don't have new antibiotics, enough new antibiotics. We are struggling to develop new antibiotics. On the other end, you mentioned Pseudomonas is acquiring new genes. So the bacteria are acquiring new genes around the world, and we don't have new antibiotics. So we have this unusual combination of the bacteria getting smarter and smarter over the last few years. And we are having less and less of good antibiotics. This situation needs to change. Dr. Nitin Bansal, are you there?
Yes, sir. Sir, I am there.
Yes. What's your opinion about the current scenario and what action is needed? Of course, there is a lot of action. All these international agencies are doing excellent work. But how can we all collaborate? How can we all come together? The clinicians, the political leaderships of all countries, these organizations, NGOs, how can we come together to fast track antibiotic development?
So there is no, I don't have a clear-cut answer to this, that this can be done, because if it was available, then we would not be discussing too much. But to come together, I think one of them is that we need to understand the seriousness of the situation, which has been dealt with in this forum itself, and which was discussed in the first session as well. We need to generate good data to reflect the actual problem which we have, and secondly, when we have the problem statement, then only we can find some solution to how to collaborate with each other, probably fast track some of the trials, and probably changing some scenarios in which we can make the importation of the drug much more easier for some of the patients, which Dr. Vasant, Dr. Ashwini were discussing. So recently I met someone from MSF who was suggesting that there is a portal known as Sugam portal already available with the government, which is generally used to import drugs for generally for non-infectious syndromes like cancer or sometimes autoimmune disorders. This is this is a window which we as in infectious disease physicians have not explored too much. And she suggested that we should be using this portal more and more often so that we can get this drug which are already in the market in Western countries and can be utilized for our patients.
Nitin, you are always very straightforward. You tell facts onto the face. straightforward. And you mentioned that if all this collaboration would have happened 10 years ago, situation would have been different. We wouldn't be sitting and talking, but that did not happen. But of course, now, at least now, we need to make that happen. Dr. Yamuna? Okay, I'll come back to John Rex. John, what exactly is your challenge in clearing the Pasture Act in US Senate? Because to me, it appears simple and straightforward. We have a fire, we need fire extinguishers. That's not happening. Why all these debates in your Senate? It should be cleared on day one. Senators should be convinced. It should have happened by evening. You submit in the morning, the same day, Senate discussion should be cleared by evening 5 before the Senate closes. Why didn't that happen?
Oh, I wish. Well, it's because it costs money. And one of the things you learn when you get into political conversations, to be obvious, is that there are many people who have something they're worried about, and they would like money too. And so all of these competing voices saying, I've got this problem, I've got that problem, I've got the other problem. So there's ultimately a balancing act that goes into deciding on the budget of any given government. And so this actually is what takes it back to my thesis that the most important people to talk to these days are the finance ministers. So the finance ministers understand that, or rather, once they get it, they will realize that the key to healthy citizens getting out there doing healthy citizen business things that make the economy whiz around is keeping them healthy. And antibiotics are what keeps them healthy. And even if you're not using one on any given day, it's there to protect your loved ones or the person who has the accident, all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's the thesis. So once you get the finance ministers to understand why they should spend money on this, that's the big hurdle. And we've seen that happen at the UN level. The UN health ministers, the G7 health ministers and the G7 finance ministers have both had declarations talking about the need to do this. And that's why it's on the political agenda. And I would close by saying that I'd like everybody to open a web browser right now and Google Wellcome Trust Reformed R&D Ecosystem. Google that and find their webpage, because they have just announced a big push to convene a global conversation on reforming the global R&D ecosystem. Many of us in this conversation have talked about the need to change or to connect various bits better. Please take a look at that. There's a webinar that they're kicking off the conversation. I think it's next week. Sign up and be there. So Wellcome Trust Reformed R&D Ecosystem. Google it now.
Yes, John, you very rightly and very loudly said one important point. We need finance ministers on board. We know that health ministers of most of the countries are convinced about the importance of AMR, but we need finance ministers on board. Recently, I was talking to one very important economist in the country, I mentioned to the economist that you need to help us because governments listens to economists and not doctors. Because government listens to economists. In UK, it's Lord Jim O'Neill who brought out the report of. I'm sure why AMR experts asked Lord Jim O'Neill to prepare the report, because they know that the governments will listen to economists. He's a famous economist. We need finance ministers and economists to come now. Some of them are on board already. We need more of them on board. If that happens, the situation will change. Yes, there are organizations like GADAP, CAPEX, AMR Action Fund with probably a few $1 million, but that may not be enough to solve our global challenge. We need much, much, much more funding from all the countries to support the antibody development. John Alter, we need your opinion on this.
Yeah, I agree with John. I think you asked him the question, why hasn't it happened? And I think he's rightfully said there are competing priorities oftentimes, not just competing health priorities, but there is, war in Ukraine, and there are, just other global priorities that the different legislative bodies, again, whether they're in the US, Europe, Europe has just introduced a big pharmaceutical legislation package that we would really like them to focus on, but they, and hopefully there will be a resolution that comes next week. So stay tuned for what happens in Brussels. But yes, the challenge of competing priorities is one that it takes voices like this and getting people to remind the politicians and policymakers that they need to pay attention here, because as we've said, the status quo is not working, and we need to preserve the companies who have the technologies for the medicines that will help the patients.
John rightly said, politicians and governments have got competing priorities. There are other important economic issues happening in countries at global level. They need to concentrate on all these issues. AMR is just one of their priorities. But it's up to us, people like us, keep on trying to convince them, keep on talking about the problem, keeping on trying to convince them how important, how serious the global challenge of AMR is. And if we remain silent, the situation will not change. We'll go back to what we were 10 years ago. And we need to keep on trying to convince the leaders, economists, political leaders on the importance of tackling AMR. Richard?
Yes, thank you. I think this is a really interesting topic. Why hasn't this moved faster, and why do we still have this problem? And I think we're hitting on a number of really important elements to it. I think John Rex's point about the health ministers is a really good one, or sorry, the finance ministers, because there is a real financial cost. And I think in this case, a comparison to the costs of COVID could be really helpful to us. COVID is certainly still fresh in everyone's mind, and the trillions of dollars of lost revenue because of COVID certainly gets their attention. And possibly that's part of why there is a little bit more of an open mind right now about political support for this. But I think that's only one part of the picture. We talked earlier, and in the previous session, there was a lot of discussion about data and surveillance data. And I think, honestly, the surveillance data for political influence may already be there. I think surveillance data and data in general serves many different purposes, but to make the argument that we need to invest more in combating AMR, I think things like the Lancet paper a couple of years ago really made a very strong case for that. So I think a combination of the financial side, the surveillance data, epidemiology data that we already have, and then the other side that we've touched on is the human side, the human stories. And there have been some really good examples from the cystic fibrosis patient population where they've been able to take real life stories, really tragic stories, and get that on the table with politicians and decision makers to really open their eyes from that front as well. So I think many different approaches. I don't think there is one single magic bullet that's going to solve this issue, but I think a combination of these can be very helpful.
Thank you. Jen, need your opinion on?
Sorry, having a hard time unmuting. So, you know, in terms of kind of working together, I think that it will be critical for the issue to be highlighted more and really pushed to the highest level of kind of like political attention. I think we can use the numbers. I also think we need to do a lot better job of highlighting the access gap. So we've done a very good job, I think, at highlighting the, very weak pipeline, the funding needs specifically. I think what we haven't done a great job on is actually highlighting the access gaps and really highlighting what it means in terms of resources to fill those gaps, resources and political will, because some of these things can be greased by policy change. So one analysis that GARD-P recently did in South Asia demonstrated that there are about 1.4 million serious bacterial infections caused by carbapenem-resistant pathogens in 2019. This was based on the Gram data, 1.4 million. We then used data from procurement, including IQVIA data, and we corrected for, underestimating certain procurement pathways. And what we saw is that of products that have some activity against carbapenem-resistant pathogens, only about 40,000 patient courses were procured in South Asia. 1.4 million infections, 40,000. That's about 2.6% coverage. If this coverage was in any other disease area, malaria, HIV, where we're trying to get to 95% coverage, this would be a global outcry. What is happening that this is not a bigger deal? And I think these are the numbers and really some of the shocking statistics we need to start bringing and putting also dollar figures or funding figures attached and policy figures attached to what it can do, how we can actually close this massive gap.
Thank you, Jen. It's
Abdul, if you can hear us, I think we lost you.
On the economic implications of COVID. And we had 6 leading economies who are important decision makers. It was easy, comparatively easy to get them on board for that webinar, all the 6 of them together. But I don't think I will succeed in getting the same 6 on board for a webinar or an AMR. I may succeed, but it will really take a lot of efforts, a lot of convincing to get them on board together to discuss AMR. But that needs to change. We need to convince economists and policymakers and politicians that AMR is equally or much more important than COVID. The death, what's happening, patients may not be lying and dying on the roadside or in front of the hospital, but they're dying in hospital, in all countries, in all hospitals across the world. And we need to convince them. We need suggestions and opinions from all the panelists. We have 5 more minutes. John, both John Rex, John Alter.
I've said my say is make your voice heard. And there are many ways to be visible. You can work inside a company. You can write a letter to your local political leadership. You can join Wellcome Trust's Global R&D Ecosystem Reform conversation next week. So please go find that stuff and make your voice heard, because that's ultimately what moves political leadership. They hear what matters to us, the average citizen on the street, and that's what moves the needle.
Thank you, John. John Alter?
I think, again, webinars like this that happen in, every country to help that groundswell of, outcry. It needs to come, again, from not just the medical, community, but from as many voices, because eventually when the noise gets loud enough, people will act. I'd also say, again, with the upcoming United Nations General Assembly high-level meeting next September, that's kind of the ultimate opportunity to have the voice heard on a global level. And there's a lot of work that's going into that. And I encourage India's voice as president of the G20 currently to add some fuel to the fire so that the fire extinguisher is needed.
Thank you, John.
Yes. So one thing is, I was at the AMR Industry Alliance board meeting a month ago. We did have representatives from Malta and Barbados who are going to chair the UNGA session in September 2024, what John was alluding to, and bring in AMR as one of the key topics or key themes. There's a lot of political hesitancy in declaring AMR a pandemic. Probably it has multiple dimensions. That one thing, if it can be cracked, I think is really going to change the landscape of response from governments in terms of investment and policy changes. So that's something I thought I would share.
Thank you, Vasan. Say Indian voice. India has got a powerful voice in the global political level. India's leadership always make change. Other countries respect India's opinion, and India's leadership in the AMR world will change the global scenario on the way how we tackle the antimicrobial resistance. Thank you all the panelists. Dr. Yamuna Devi, our trustee, would you please say a few words and conclude the meeting?
Sir, she has left, I think, sir.
Yeah, the reason is we infection specialists, this is the real scenario. You will see that our infection specialists are disappearing in between. The reason is we get call from the hospital. Every 15 minutes, we get call. We need your support in dealing with these drug-resistant infections in the ICU or other units. And that's the reality of the situation. So on behalf of Dr. Yamuna, I will say a few words, thanking the excellent, our journalists, our esteemed panelists. We had a wonderful discussion with our esteemed panelists from pharmaceutical sector and international organizations who support antibiotic development. We need to think global and act local. Though the challenge of AMR is very big, with collective action, we will succeed in tackling the global challenge of antimicrobial resistance. We are indeed grateful to the doctors who gave their small donation to the trust and the pharmaceutical companies like Sanofi, Galangen, Converge, Alniche, Viatris, Cipla, Fusion, and Pfizer, who have provided us with small unrestricted grants for various webinars over the last 1 year, so that we can conduct the webinar without any registration fees. Thank you very much for all the panelists in the first and second session. It was a wonderful webinar. Let's hope webinars like this, we will take the momentum forward and will make a change in the way we tackle antimicrobial resistance at the global level. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.